We can also have something called a food chain to describe the transfer of energy from producers to consumers to even higher level consumers. So it's a sequence of organisms through which energy is transferred. And here's a very basic food chain right here. We see phytoplankton, the primary producers, being eaten by the zooplankton, the primary consumers, and then small fish, mackerel, snapper, and finally a large shark. And once again, that flow of energy is unidirectional. But the important thing to remember that this isn't always a very simple process. It doesn't follow sort of this linear line going from phytoplankton to progressively larger and larger organisms. We just saw that when we were talking about krill and the blue whale. So what would be a more accurate representation of this food chain? A more accurate representation would not be a food chain, but it'd be a food web. And what we see now is several interconnections between different organisms. This is actually a better state to have things because what happens is there's a greater chance of survival. For example, if all of a sudden we lose one of these components, maybe the small fish, there's still other ways that members within this food web can obtain nutrition, can obtain energy. So in a food web, there's more available food, there's more biomass to eat, and there's more than one way to get that food, to get that energy. We are now going to take a look at how different marine environments are classified. And this is important because what we see is that different marine organisms will inhabit different zones. So some organisms will find in deep parts of the ocean in the aphotic zone. Other organisms, like the primary producers, the phytoplankton, the primary consumers, the zooplankton, we're going to find in the upper portion of the ocean known as the photic zone. So we're going to look at over the next few slides is how we can classify these different marine environments, different terms that we can use to refer to them. One thing I've done here is I've created a summary slide of the classification of marine environments. So you'll see that this is all color coded depending if we're looking at marine environments, depending on ocean floor features, if it's a pelagic environment, how those can be defined, how pelagic environments by depth can be defined, zones of sunlight, is it euphotic, aphotic zone, dysphotic zone, as well as benthic environments. We'll talk about all of these over the next couple of moments. This slide explores the relationship between the euphotic, dysphotic, and aphotic zones to one another. So these are zones, these are marine environments that are based on light, how much sunlight penetrates into the ocean. The photic zone, as you should know by now, this is where we have visible light. That can be broken down into the euphotic zone, sometimes to a depth of 70 to 100 meters, depending on where you are in the world's oceans. This is where we have enough light both for fish and other organisms to see, as well as for photosynthesis to occur. This is where the bulk of biological productivity occurs in the ocean. Then underneath this, extending to a depth of 600 meters to even 1,000 meters in some locations, we have the dysphotic zone. Enough light to see by, but not enough sunlight for photosynthesis. And then below this, we have the aphotic zone. And here in the aphotic zone, there's no sunlight. It's known sometimes as the night zone, the dark zone, the midnight zone, because we see absolutely no light within that zone. Next, we're going to look at the pelagic zones. The pelagic zones refer to like the open oceans, so are not right at the bottom of the ocean floor. We're not along the coastline, but this is the open water. What we see in the pelagic zones is the definition of them, or the classification of different pelagic zones, is based on depth. So we can go from anywhere from the epipelagic, where we see enough light for photosynthesis, so this closely ties into the euphotic zone, all the way down to a zone known as the hadopelagic zone. So at the upper surface, and we have a little chart here on the far right that shows the different zones and sort of the approximate depths to which they extend. We have the epipelagic. As I said, there's enough light present in the upper portions of the epipelagic zone. We have enough light for photosynthesis to occur. And the other important thing here is because we're close to the surface and in contact with the atmosphere, we see high levels of oxygen dissolved within the water as well. This water is very oxygen rich. Below the epipelagic zone is the mesopelagic zone. This is sometimes referred to in terms of light levels as the twilight zone. So we still have a little bit of light penetrating down into these depths, but not enough for photosynthesis. We see that oxygen levels, dissolved oxygen within the ocean water, is starting to decrease. So we have low O2 levels. Once again, we're not in contact with the atmosphere, so we're not getting that sort of input of oxygen into the water. The other things, the animals that we sometimes see that dominate down here, squid, swordfish, nautiluses, these are all different types of marine organisms that occur here. Whales will often dive down to this depth as well. And then as we go deeper into the water column, we get to the pelagic and the abyssal pelagic zones, and even into the halopelagic zones. Here it's dark. If you're an organism that lives in here, you have to create your own light. And this is typically done by bioluminescence. So you have specialized cells that produce a slight glow to them. This is also an area of high pressure, so you have to have special adaptations to your body plan to help deal with these high pressure environments. You have a lot of water sitting on top of you. Once again, we do sometimes see some organisms from more commonly associated with the surface waters entering these zones. For example, sperm whales are capable of diving to depth quite often of 2 kilometers, but they're only down there for a short period of time and then return back up to the surface waters. One of the reasons why whales need oxygen to breathe, they need to return to the surface to breathe oxygen, which brings us to the final point here. We find very low levels of oxygen within these zones. It doesn't mean that there is no oxygen dissolved in the water, but extremely low levels of oxygen dissolved in the water. We've discussed very briefly the pelagic environments. These are the marine environments that we can break down in according to where they sit in the open ocean, how shallow they are, how deep they are. We also have benthic environments, and benthic refers to anything associated with or occurring on the bottom of a body of water, such as the ocean. The important thing here to remember is it doesn't have anything to do with depth. So you can have a benthic environment very close to the coastline in very shallow water. You can have a benthic environment in much deeper water. We have a number of different types of zones within the benthic environment. Some of them are the intertidal zone, the sublittoral zone, as well as the bathal zone. And this just refers to where they occur. There's a little chart here up on the upper right. It shows approximate locations of these. The bathal zone, we're getting into deeper water once again. We don't see a lot of life right at the ocean floor. Intertidal, this is a benthic zone that's exposed when tide is low and covered by water when tide is high. And the sublittoral zone, this is basically just sitting slightly offshore, just offshore of the intertidal zone. And this is where you find the bulk of life within the ocean. A few other terms that we should review, I think we looked at these a little bit earlier on. These refer to how animals move or live within these marine environments. We have the nekton. Nekton are animals that can swim, animals that can move themselves through the water using their own means. So once again, through swimming, other animals such as squids can use a form of jet propulsion to move through the water. But what can happen is they don't have to go wherever ocean currents or ocean waves are pushing them. They can swim against those currents and actually physically move themselves in the direction that they want to travel. We also have organisms that inhabit the benthic zone. Once again, remember, you can be in shallow water and have the benthic zone. You can be in deep water and have the benthic zone. And the benthos are all animals that live near or on or in the ocean floor, once again, at all water depths. So we'll see when we say in the ocean floor that there are some organisms, types of invertebrates, clams are an example, that will actually burrow or dig down into the sediment at the bottom of the ocean floor and live sort of just below the surface. These are part of the benthos. We can use a couple other terms to talk about these animals that live in the benthic environment. These animals are part of the benthos. Remember, they can live on or near or in the ocean floor. What the terms we use are epifaunal. These are animals that live on the sediment. So for example, here, if you look at the numbers are kind of blurry, but if you look at, it looks like a number 6 for the mussels or a number 1 there. These are all examples of epifaunal organisms. We have infaunal. These are organisms that actually burrow down and live in the sediment, or sometimes they can even burrow through rock and live in rock that makes up the ocean floor. And then we have the necobenthos, and these are animals that swim, but they swim just above the bottom. They don't really inhabit the water column per se, but they just swim right above the surface or the seafloor, and because of this we call them the necobenthos. A few other terms that you should be aware of, and it seems like sort of a catch-all right now of terms, but all of these are important when we start talking about the marine organisms themselves, are the terms habitat and niche. Habitat refers to the physical location of an organism. So basically think of it as this organism's address within a community. You live at a certain address within a community. Your job could be a student. So the community, for example, Katy University could be your habitat, and your niche, your occupation, would be a student. And that brings us to the next definition, a niche. Basically, it's the relationship of an organism to food and enemies. What does it do? So I kind of gave you this at Katy University and student example. We see another example here from the marine environment. We have a coral reef. The coral reef would be the habitat. And then we have a picture of a parrotfish. And a parrotfish its niche within the coral reef is to sit there and feed on the coral reef. It eats algae that grows on top of the corals. Plays a really important job, helps keep the corals clean, and that's its relationship to its food. Enemies, it basically has to kind of watch out for the other fish that want to eat it. So here we have a really good example of what a habitat is and what a niche is. So let's continue to look at these habitats a little bit, and we're actually going to go back and revisit them in lecture module 11. But one of the hallmarks of these habitats is biological diversity. And what we see with biological diversity is the number of species. How many species do we have in a community? The more we have, the higher the variety of species, the more complex the interactions between organisms. So if you have a habitat that might only have 1 or 2 or 3 species, you're going to have very basic interactions between them, and one's probably eating the other one. End of story. But you get more species within a community, you get very complex interactions. Some very interesting things happen. One of these is competition. You can imagine if you have a whole bunch of different species within a community, or a whole bunch of different genuses, they're all going to be competing sometimes for the exact same products, for the exact same things that they need to live, necessities of life. So things like food, things like light, access to light, things like even space. And we can see this competition occurring, as it says inside here, between members of the same population or of different populations. So here we have a competition. This little example here shows an example of competition between 2 different species of barnacles, so roughly the same populations. And you can see here we have the Balanus barnacle sort of in the lower part of that image there, on the lower surface of the rock, and then the other variety, I'm not even going to try to say that name there, but we're going to call them barnacle number 2 on the upper portion. And these actually are quite common in the intertidal zone. So once again, this is the part of the ocean that is exposed during low tide and covered by water during high tide. What we see is there's some of them, barnacle number 2, does a really good job of withstanding exposure. And what that means is when the tide goes out and that barnacle is exposed to air, it doesn't dry out as quickly as other types of barnacles do. On the bottom part, we have the Balanus. These guys can grow very, very large or rapidly grow, but they're sensitive to desiccation. So as the tide goes out, they're really, if the tide goes to get really low tide, maybe a low spring tide, what happens is these have the potential to dry out and end up dying. They're very sensitive to drying out. What we see, though, is this area between the 2 of them called the area of competition. And within them, what we see is that these 2 different species of barnacles are going to battle to take control of that area. And not battle in the sense that they're going out with weapons to fight each other, but they're going to see who can inhabit it more. The Balanus, which grows really quickly, so they might grow faster than barnacle number 2, they can overtake that space, but they dry out faster and they can die, which gives barnacle number 2 a chance to sort of infill and take over that space. So we'll see this quite often in marine communities as competition. One type of species has an advantage for some set of conditions over another. Who can exploit that, who can take advantage of that, are usually the species that's going to win out within this competition. We also see something called symbiosis within the ocean, within ocean communities, within habitats. And what symbiosis is a very close long-term living relationship between organisms, typically organisms between that are different species. So one example we might look at in a second is between sharks and a type of fish called remora. They live together, very close quarters, and they both sort of benefit from this symbiotic relationship. So we'll take a look at a couple of these types of symbiotic relationships over the next few slides. So in the basic sense with symbiosis, think of it as the classic you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of scenario. But what we see is there are slightly different variations within these symbiotic relationships. And one of them is commensalism. And what we see with commensalism is that one organism is going to benefit from the relationship between the 2 different organisms. The other one might be a little bit of benefit, but it doesn't really get significantly harmed or helped. So it's sort of like, okay, yeah, you're my beer drinking buddy. I'm going to let you live here, drink my beer. It doesn't really bother me, and you're getting free beer from me. That's one way to think of commensalism. Examples that we see in the marine environment here, we have the classic example of the clownfish and the sea anemone. Sea anemones sting. The clownfish is immune. They kind of have a mucus across their body that makes it immune to them. So the anemone isn't bothered by the fact that a clownfish lives within it. But what happens is the clownfish is protected from other predators. Something tries to eat the clownfish, it swims within the sea anemone. Nothing's going to go after it because it knows, hey, those tentacles of the sea anemone, they sting, it's going to hurt me. Another type of example we see here, this is from the fossil record, but something that I think is kind of cool, which I don't know what that says about me, is example of a coprophage. So here we have an ancient type of echinoderm called a crinoid. We see a gastropod, a type of sea snail sitting on top of it, and that sea snail would live atop of these ancient echinoderms and basically ingest waste material, feces, as it was released by these sea lilies. So this is known as a coprophage. It's taking advantage of food in the form of feces that's being released by the organism that it's living on. And the organism that's living on is just like, oh yeah, you're not bothering me, no big deal. Another form of symbiosis is mutualism. This is where both individuals benefit. So what you see here is we have the classic sort of example of a shark with remora. The remora attach themselves to the shark, usually the belly or wherever on the shark, by the use of a sucker disc in its mouth, and it travels wherever the shark goes. It eats parasites off of the shark, which helps the shark's overall health. The shark gets to stay clean and healthy, and what happens is all the stuff, all the parasites, even any little bits of food that might be left over that might fly out of the shark's mouth as it's munching on its dinner, the remora eat, and the remora benefit because they get food. So the sharks get to stay clean and healthy, the remora get to eat and stay healthy. Both individuals benefit. And then the final example we see of symbiosis is that of parasitism. Parasitism, not a good thing if you're the host. So what happens is a parasite inhabits a host. The parasite's going to benefit from the relationship, but the host is going to be harmed. It's either going to be sick or can potentially even die. So here what we see, and it's kind of in the highlighted area in that crab there, is a parasitic barnacle. And the parasitic barnacle, I'm sorry if you're a little faint of heart here, is rooted within the reproductive system of the crab. What it does is it cuts off all reproduction for the infected crab, can cause male crabs to change behavior, which isn't surprising. But what happens, what we see is that now if the barnacle reproduces, if the barnacle reproduces, but the male, if the barnacle is attached to it, will take care of that barnacle as if it's a bunch of eggs, a bunch of crab eggs. So the male crab has no idea what's going on. He thinks he's caring for a bunch of eggs, all due to the fact that he has this barnacle, this parasitic barnacle attached to his reproductive organism. So it causes harm to the crab, but the barnacle benefits from the whole entire relationship. Not only do we have symbiotic relationships between organisms within a marine community or within a marine ecosystem, we also see that different physical and biological factors can influence what goes on within that community. So these factors can be physical. It can be things such as changes in temperature, salinity, pressure, the amount of gases dissolved in the water, pH levels, or the factors can be biological in origin. They can be things such as crowding. Do we have too many of a species in one area? Predation, who's hunting for who? Things like grazing. Are we eating a lot of algae for a small marine invertebrate? Shading. The sun is great, but sometimes even the sun shining on you if an organism in the water can be a bad thing. And even, competition for resources, food resources. There's only so much oxygen dissolved in the water. Who's going to get that? Who isn't? So all of these factors can play a role in what goes on in a marine ecosystem or an ocean community. These factors can be referred to as a limiting factor, and a limiting factor, I'm just going to read it directly off the slide here because it's a good definition. A biological or physical factor in the ocean environment that controls or limits the normal actions of an organism. So you can have too much of a limiting factor, too much of something can be a limiting factor, too little of something can be a limiting factor. Little diagram to sort of further illustrate the concept of limiting factor. So we can have animals that are steno, which steno means is we might say they're stenohyaline, which means that they can only live in a really narrow range of salinities. We can also have organisms that are euryhaline. Eury means wide range. So these are organisms that can live in a wide range of differing salinities within the water. So if we're in an area where we might get an input from river or fresh water, they're better adapted to live within the environment than organisms that are strictly stenohyaline. What we see within these limiting factors is an optimal range. This is where we see the most members of a particular species living. Conditions are perfect. And then either side of that, we have a zone of some stress, physiological stress. And then finally, we have these zones, these outer sort of edges of this bell curve here, where conditions just aren't appropriate for that particular organism to live. Here we have an example of a limiting factor. We're going to compare bull sharks and clownfish. We're going to go back to that where we talked about, are you able to live in a wide range of salinity conditions? Are you able to live in a low range of salinity conditions? We see the bull shark, and this is a shark that actually scares me more than a great white shark, and that's the fact that bull sharks are euryhaline, so they can survive in both fresh water and salt water. So you'd be swimming in a river close to the ocean, and you could still have a shark there that's ready to chomp on you. These guys are pretty nasty. So in this case here, in the case of a bull shark, salinity is not a limiting factor. Maybe temperature is a limiting factor. Maybe it's stenothermal, thermal referring to temperature, but salinity is not a factor in where this particular organism lives. If you look at the clownfish, on the other hand, it can only live in salt water and within a certain range of salinities. So these clownfish, our example, are stenohaline. Salinity is a limiting factor in their lives. Just go back to the bull sharks. I have a little note here. They can travel up the Mississippi River. They've been known to travel up the Mississippi River as far as Illinois. So yeah, it can be some pretty nasty things. And it's believed that these are the guys that were inspiration for the movie and the novel Jaws. So you can imagine then that if you have all these factors that control where an animal lives, if you have symbiosis occurring as well, that there can be different types of distributions of organisms within a marine environment. So here we're talking about not only just certain species, but all organisms in a marine habitat in general. And we can see sort of three types of distributions. We have a uniform distribution, which is fairly rare. We have a random distribution, which is uncommon, and then finally we have the clump distribution, which is the common type. With the uniform distribution, what we see is that nothing is affecting nothing's playing a factor or role in where an organism lives. So there's nothing, there's not sort of a glut of food somewhere and everyone's going to be sort of living near that food source. Everything is so uniform, almost so boring, that organisms live in a certain set pattern. This is very, very rare. We almost never see it. We have random distribution. No one individual affects the other. Conditions are the same throughout. This will occur, fairly uncommon though. And then finally we get the most common one. This is the clump distribution. And what we see here is that there's going to be areas in the ocean floor within the ocean where we have optimal growth conditions. There might be physical protection, nutrient concentration. This is what we see with coral reefs. And that's going to play a big role affecting where organisms live. All the organisms are going to tend to sort of clump together in the areas that give them everything they need or is necessary for them to live. The final thing that we see that promotes diversity within a marine ecosystem, within a marine habitat or an ocean community, all these terms I kind of use interchangeably, is that there is going to be change over time. And this change can occur over millions of years, such as through evolution, or it can change rapidly due to a natural catastrophe. For example, when the meteorite hit the Earth and the dinosaurs went extinct, this caused an extinction too within some of the different genuses within the ocean. Or we can have a catastrophic change due to human influences. This is what we're starting to see happening within the world's oceans in the present, with warming ocean temperatures, increasing amounts of chemicals and garbage, things such as plastics within the oceans. So we'll see within these ecosystems, within these habitats, that they will change over time. Either sort of a slow change, evolution once again, or rapid change driven by man-made or naturally occurring processes.